They say the world ended on a Tuesday. I don't know if that's true. I wasn't paying attention to the calendar when the missiles fell. I was in the middle of a lesson, Ryuken's voice cutting through the sound of my own breathing, telling me that the pressure point beneath the left clavicle, if struck with the correct 2 fingers at the correct angle, would cause the heart to seize in exactly 4 seconds. He was very particular about the 4 seconds. He said a man who understood how long 4 seconds truly lasted understood everything there was to know about mortality. The sky lit up orange through the dojo windows. Ryuken didn't stop talking. That was a long time ago. Years before the Crossmen. Years before Shin. Years before the 7 scars on my chest that ache every time the temperature drops, which out here in the flats means they ache most of the time. I'll tell you what I remember, all of it, because someone should. After World War III, water became the only currency that mattered. Not gold. Not ammunition, though ammunition ran a close second. Water. The aquifers that hadn't been poisoned by fallout were controlled by whoever had the muscle to hold them. In the early years, a dozen factions tore the wastelands apart, fighting over every clean well, every seep, every trickle that came down off the high ground. Men killed for a canteen. Women bartered things I won't describe for a week's supply. Children died of thirst in the ruins of cities that had once flooded their streets every time it rained. Into that chaos, 2 schools emerged. Not armies exactly, though they had fighters. Not governments, though they had law. They were something older than both. Traditions. Disciplines built over generations, honed against the worst that the human body could do to itself and to others. North Star, Southern Cross. My school, his school. The names sound simple. They were not simple. Each tradition represented a centuries-long accumulation of knowledge about the human body, its architecture, its pressure points, the invisible map of nerves and meridians and relay clusters that underlies the visible structure of bone and muscle. Both schools had derived their techniques from the same ancient source, a single foundational discipline that had divided centuries ago along a philosophical fault line. What is this knowledge for? North Star said it was for protection. Southern Cross said it was for dominance. The practical techniques were often identical. The purpose differed completely. That difference in purpose was not a small thing. Purpose shapes practice in ways that are not immediately visible. The way you train when you believe you are training to protect someone is different from the way you train when you believe you are training to defeat someone, even if the movements of each session are the same. The first makes you patient. The second makes you aggressive. Over time, over years and decades of practice, that difference becomes structural. It lives in the body. It determines what you reach for when the conscious mind has no time to deliberate. I did not understand this fully until I fought Shin in that high-ceilinged room and felt the difference not as a philosophy but as a physical fact. North Star held that the art existed to protect. You learned to destroy so that you could stand between the destroyers and the people who couldn't stop them. Every technique Ryuken taught me was framed that way. The pressure points, the strikes that could stop a heart or restart one, the understanding of how the body's hidden architecture could be turned against itself. All of it was in service of a principle. You carry something terrible so that ordinary people don't have to. Southern Cross held that whoever held the power deserved to hold it, that the strong owed nothing to the weak, that order and domination were the same words spoken in different tones. Shin held both schools' knowledge. He had crossed over, trained under masters of both disciplines, absorbing what each had to offer. That was rare. That was supposed to be impossible, the way oil and water are impossible to mix. But Shin had always been exceptional. I knew that better than anyone. He had been my sparring partner once, my friend once. The night he came for Ryuken, I was in the eastern courtyard practicing forms. I heard the sound of a single impact, the kind that ends something rather than begins it, and then silence. By the time I reached the main hall, Ryuken was already on the ground and Shin was standing over him, not even breathing hard. I remember thinking, he doesn't look any different. He was wearing the same clothes he'd worn to every training session we'd shared. His face had the same sharp, watchful quality it always had. The only thing different was the look in his eyes, a settled quality, like a decision made and done with. "It had to be one of us," he said. "You know that." I didn't know that. I still don't. But I was 23 years old and I had just watched my master die, and the grief hit me the way a car hits a wall, not gradually, but all at once, every part of me impacting simultaneously. I wasn't thinking clearly. I came at him without a plan. He beat me methodically. I remember that more than the pain, the patience of it, the way he waited for each of my attacks and then redirected rather than resisting. He knew my training as well as his own. He knew exactly where I was going before I arrived. And when he had me on the ground, when I was barely able to lift my arms, he knelt over me with something in his right hand, a blade, thin and precise, and he carved into my chest, one by one. 7 scars, the shape of the Big Dipper, his calling card, his signature, his claim that he had been here and had won. I felt each one clearly, which was worse than feeling nothing. He wanted me to feel them. He wanted me to carry them. "You are already dead," he said. "This is just the paperwork." Then he took Julia and left. I don't know exactly how long I lay in that courtyard. Long enough for the blood to dry and the flies to arrive, and the sun to move from one side of the dojo to the other. Long enough for the pain to shift from acute to chronic to something I could work around. I sat up. That surprised me. I hadn't been certain I could. I stood up. That surprised me more. The courtyard was empty. The dojo was empty. What had been the center of everything I knew was just a collection of buildings now, already beginning to feel abandoned. Ryuken's body was still in the main hall. I wrapped him in the good canvas we kept for winter, the heavy gray cloth that had insulated the storehouse against frost. I buried him under the pine at the north corner of the yard. I didn't know the right words to say, so I said nothing. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked away. That was 3 years ago. In 3 years, I had learned what the world had become. I had walked most of it, or what remained of it, moving through the dust-colored towns and the rubble-strewn highways and the cracked flatlands where nothing grew anymore, except a kind of coarse, gray-brown scrub that the locals called deadweed. I had encountered the Crossmen dozens of times, in different configurations under different sergeants, always wearing the same uniform, heavy black with a crossed-sword insignia on the chest, and always behaving in the same way. They occupied. They taxed. They enforced. They took water rights away from settlements that couldn't defend themselves and charged a tithe for access that those same settlements had exercised freely since before the war. They were Shin's instrument. His reach across the wasteland, extended and organized, touching every community that sat near a water source. I avoided them when I could. I dealt with them when I couldn't. I had learned to be efficient. I came into the settlement they called Paradise Valley on foot, from the south, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and the knowledge in my hands. It was evening. The light was that color it gets in the wastelands, amber turning bronze, the dust in the air catching it and diffusing it so that everything looks slightly unreal, slightly lit from the inside. Paradise Valley was a small place, maybe 300 people, clustered around the well that sat at the center of what had once been a proper town square. There was a market of sorts, stalls made of salvaged metal and old lumber, selling food, tools, cloth, information. There was a structure that served as a gathering hall, with walls made of mismatched material and a roof that clearly leaked when it rained but was better than nothing. There were children running in the dust between the stalls, which told me more about this place than anything else could have. Children only run when they feel safe. Children only play when someone is watching over them. I had passed through a dozen settlements in the weeks before that were not like this. Places where the Crossmen had already moved in, where the perimeter guards wore the black uniform and the cross-sword insignia, where the people moved through their days with that particular contracted quality, that inward drawing that is not cowardice but caution refined past the point where it lives in the conscious mind, and has become something structural, a posture adopted so continuously that the body forgets it was ever any different. In those places, nobody ran. Nobody raised their voice in the way of ordinary civilian volume, the natural amplitude of a person who does not believe they are being listened to by someone with authority over them. Everything was modulated. Everything was careful. The Crossmen called this order. What they had actually produced was a silence with teeth in it. Paradise Valley hadn't been reached yet, or had been reached and had pushed back enough to be left temporarily alone, which amounted to the same thing in the short term. The children running between the stalls were proof of something the Crossmen could not yet account for, proof that this place had not yet learned to be afraid in the sustained, architectural way that Shin's militia required of the communities it administered. That was worth noting. It was also, I understood even then, a temporary condition. I found shelter in a storage building on the edge of the settlement. The family who owned it offered me floor space in exchange for splitting wood, which I did until after dark, working by the light of a lantern they lent me. The woman of the house fed me something that was mostly grain with some dried protein of uncertain origin mixed through it. I ate all of it without comment. It tasted fine. In the morning, I met Bat. He was maybe 16, angular and quick, with the permanent wariness in his eyes that you saw in every kid who'd grown up in the wasteland years. That faint readiness, the way they tracked movement at the edge of their vision even when they were ostensibly paying attention to something else. He caught me watching the well from a distance and came and stood beside me. "You're not from here," he said. "No. Passing through." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, evaluating me the way a kid that age evaluates adults when he's had to develop judgment early and doesn't have the luxury of being wrong. "There's a girl," he said finally. "Lynn, she can't see. Hasn't been able to since the Crossmen came through last year and killed her parents in front of her. Whatever she saw, her eyes stopped working after that." He paused. "I heard there are people who can fix things like that. Pressure points, nerve pathways, old knowledge." I looked at him. He looked back steady and direct. "Where is she?" I said. Lynn was 12 years old and sat very still in a chair in the gathering hall, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes open but unfocused. The unseeing eyes of someone who is not blind in the conventional sense, not dark behind them, but absent, as though the processing had simply stopped somewhere between the eye and the understanding. She didn't flinch when I approached. She could hear me fine. I examined the points at the base of her skull, the secondary pathways along her jaw, the specific cluster beneath the occipital ridge that governs the translation of light into image. Ryukin had shown me the technique for this once, a restorative application rather than a destructive one. He had said, "The same knowledge that can stop a heart can restart one, if you understand the direction." I applied my thumb and 2 fingers with careful, specific pressure, held for a count of 7, released. Lynn blinked. Her eyes moved. She looked at her own hands as if she had never seen them before, which in some sense she hadn't, not for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Oh," she said quietly. I stood up. "Take care of yourself," I told her. I was halfway out of the settlement when Bat caught up with me again. "There's a resistance," he said, falling into step beside me without being invited. "People organizing against the Crossmen. Not many yet, but growing. We could use someone who knows how to fight the way you fight." "No. You didn't even think about it." "I thought about it." "What did you conclude?" I stopped walking. I turned and looked at him. He was breathing hard from having run to catch me, but he held my gaze without dropping it. I respected that. "I concluded that I have a destination," I said, "and that getting involved in other people's fights delays reaching it." "And when you reach your destination," Bat said, "and you do whatever you're going to do when you get there, then what? There'll still be Crossmen. There'll still be people living like this." He gestured without looking at the settlement behind him, a gesture that somehow contained the well and the stalls and the children and the dust and the patched-up roof of the gathering hall. "You can fix a girl's eyes, but you can't fix what keeps causing the damage in the first place. It was a good argument. I had no counter for it. I walked away anyway. That was a mistake. It's one of the ones I carry. They came 2 nights later. I heard it before I saw it, the sound of vehicles, which in the wasteland is the sound of power and the people who have it. The Crossmen rode in on heavy modified transports, 6 of them, with spotlights mounted on the frames and the cross-sword insignia painted on the doors in red that someone had clearly intended to look like blood. They came in at speed, and they knew exactly where to go. They always knew. Someone always told them. By the time I had positioned myself on a ridge above the settlement and could see clearly, they had already secured the well. The militia soldiers, the Crossmen, moved in practiced formations, tight and practiced, establishing a perimeter in minutes. Their sergeant was a large man I recognized even from distance, heavyset, head wrapped in leather bandaging that covered his skull from the crown to the jaw, leaving only his face exposed from nose to chin. Jackal. I had encountered him once before, 18 months back, in a settlement outside the old highway junction. I had done something to his head that required the bandaging. He remembered me. He was holding that memory, I was certain, like a stone in a closed fist. Jackal found Lynn within minutes of arriving. She had apparently said something, a warning, a threat, a mention of my name. Whatever it was, it had the wrong effect. He took her prisoner rather than killing her on the spot, which meant he intended to use her. As bait, as leverage, as a tool to draw out whatever he feared I represented. I was watching all of this from 200 meters away, crouched in the deadweed on the ridge, weighing my options. The calculation wasn't complicated. If I left now, I could be at the outskirts of Southern Cross within 4 days. I would reach Shin. I would finish what he had started 3 years ago in a courtyard while my master's body cooled on the tiles. That was my destination. That was the thing I had walked 3 years toward. But Lynn was 12 years old and had just gotten her eyes back. I went down into the settlement. I entered from the northern side, through the narrow passage between 2 storage structures that the Crossmen hadn't bothered to guard because it was barely wide enough to walk through sideways. Bat found me before I found him, which told me he had been waiting, which told me he had expected me to come back. "They have her in the main hall," he said quietly. 3 guards inside, 2 outside the entrance. The sergeant is somewhere in the middle of the square. "How many total?" 30, maybe 35. "Positions." He told me. He had clearly been watching carefully, which took a particular kind of nerve for a 16-year-old in the dark, with 30 armed soldiers between him and the exit. We moved. I won't walk through every engagement in sequence. The mechanics of violence, described in detail, lose their meaning and become something else, something closer to entertainment than to truth. What I will say is that the Crossmen were trained and organized and operated with the confidence of a force that had never encountered serious resistance. That confidence was a liability, a unit that has never had its assumptions challenged fights differently from one that has. The assumptions live in the body, in the reflexes, in the way a soldier pivots when he hears movement behind him, and what he leads with in that pivot. Their assumptions were wrong about what I was capable of. I worked through them systematically, keeping the pressure on from multiple angles, using the darkness and the confined spaces between the settlement structures to prevent them from organizing a coordinated response. Each engagement was brief. Pressure point strikes do not require extended contact. A thumb pressed with precision into the cluster of nerves at the junction of the neck and shoulder causes the arm on that side to lose function for approximately 90 seconds. A knuckle driven at the specific angle into the solar plexus does not just knock the wind out. It seizes the diaphragm, creating a panic response that overwrites tactical thinking and reduces a trained soldier to an animal gasping for breath. I freed Lynn from the main hall. The guards inside went down in sequence, too quickly for any of them to raise an alarm. She was unharmed. I handed her off to an older man in the gathering hall, Asher, the settlement elder, who had been organizing the non-combatants in the back room and went back out. Bat had gotten himself into a bad spot. He had drawn Jackal's attention somehow, and the big man had him in the open, in the center of the square near the well, with 3 soldiers at his back. Bat was armed with a piece of rebar he'd picked up somewhere, and was using it with more courage than technique. He was bleeding from his side. I crossed the open ground fast. Jackal saw me coming. He had been waiting for this, clearly. The soldiers were the occasion, but I was the event. He sent the 3 soldiers at me first and stepped back, watching, wanting to evaluate before he committed. The 3 were experienced fighters, not just enforcers. They came in coordinated, not at the same time but in sequence, each one designed to occupy me while the next attacked. It was a good technique. Against most opponents it would have been effective. I had been trained by a man who showed me how to process 3 simultaneous threats by prioritizing not by proximity but by lethality. The most dangerous first, always, regardless of position. The one in the middle, directly ahead, is not automatically the most dangerous. The one with the best angle of attack from your peripheral vision often is. I took them down in 6 seconds. I counted afterward because Ryukin had taught me to count. Jackal came in, without the soldiers to hide behind. He was stronger than he looked, which is saying something because he looked very strong. He had the kind of size that suggests the person inside it has been doing serious physical work for decades. Not just training but labor, real weight, real resistance. His strikes came from the hips and shoulders simultaneously, which indicated genuine knowledge behind the raw power. He had been trained too. Whatever school it was, it had done its work. But he had never encountered North Star. The pressure points on a body are the same regardless of the body's size. The nerve cluster beneath the clavicle does not care how much muscle overlies it. Jackal's bulk was not a defense against precision. It was irrelevant to precision. I took hits during the engagement. I want to be honest about that. He landed 3 solid blows, ribs, jaw, the back of my left shoulder, and each one hurt in the immediate, serious way that tells you the structural damage is real and will need to be addressed. A cracked rib is not a performance. It changes how you breathe, and how you breathe changes everything. I worked through it. When I had Jackal on the ground, kneeling, one arm immobilized, I looked at him for a long moment. "When you get back to your master," I said, "tell him I'm coming." I applied one more point and he went unconscious. He would wake up in an hour or so, in pain but functional. I left him that way deliberately. He was the message. You don't kill the messenger. I found Bat propped against the well housing, holding his ribs on the left side where the bleeding was. It wasn't as bad as it looked. Side wounds bleed freely, but the ones that look worst are often not the ones that kill you. I checked the depth, the angle. The blade had gone in between the ribs rather than through one, which was luck for Bat, the kind of luck that looks like skill from a distance. I packed the wound with what we had available and talked him through slowing his breathing. He kept trying to ask me questions, and I kept ignoring the questions and talking about the breathing. He survived. He would carry the scar. That seems fitting somehow. The people who survive things carry the proof of it. I sent Jackal back to Shin with his bandages intact and his consciousness restored and the message I had given him. Then I left Paradise Valley, heading north toward the city that Shin had named Southern Cross, named for his school, his discipline, his claim on the world. I walked for 3 days. I don't have much to say about those 3 days, except that the walking gave me time to think. And what I thought about was mostly not the fight ahead, but the one behind the courtyard, Ryukin's canvas-wrapped body, the sound of a single impact that ended the world I had known. I thought about the 7 scars and the 4 seconds, and the lesson that had been interrupted by orange light through the dojo windows. I thought about a man who had been my sparring partner, and what it means when someone who knows you completely, who has stood across from you in practice and touched all your limits, decides to use that knowledge against you. I tried not to think about Julia. I tried. I was not entirely successful. She had been a student at the dojo, not a martial arts student, but someone who came for the philosophical teaching that Ryukin offered alongside the physical discipline. She had a stillness to her, a quality of attention that made you feel, when she was listening to you, that you were the only thing in the world. I had loved her in the way you love things that seem both fragile and permanent, the way you love old trees, or certain kinds of light, or a melody you can't quite remember but can't stop reaching for. Shin had loved her too. That was the part I had never been able to fit neatly into my understanding of events. He hadn't taken her out of cruelty. He had taken her because he wanted her. There is something almost harder about that. An enemy who acts from desire rather than malice is harder to reduce to simple categories. Malice I could meet with its equivalent. Desire I had to meet with something else. I wasn't sure yet what that something else was. I thought about it for 3 days. I didn't arrive at an answer. I arrived at Southern Cross instead. The city rose out of the flatlands like a statement. Shin had built on the bones of a pre-war industrial complex, a cluster of heavy manufacturing facilities that the missiles had damaged but not destroyed, reinforcing what survived and constructing around it. The result was a place that looked intentional, planned, organized, maintained. The streets inside the outer wall were clear of rubble. The buildings had been repaired. There were lights, actual electric lights running on what must have been a significant generator system. From the outside, standing in the wasteland dust and looking through the main gate at the illuminated interior, you could almost believe this was how civilization was supposed to reassemble itself. Almost. The people inside the walls had the look I'd seen in every Crossmen-controlled settlement, amplified and concentrated. The particular way of walking when you live under enforcement, slightly contracted, slightly inward, the eyes doing more work than the body to assess and avoid contact. Not slaves in any technical sense, just people who had made themselves small as a survival strategy and had been small for long enough that it was becoming structural. I didn't enter through the main gate. I found the seam in the eastern wall where 2 different construction periods met, and the material was not quite flush. A vertical gap of maybe 4 inches, wider at the base, and I worked it with my hands and with patience until I had created enough space to enter laterally, moving slowly, not forcing anything, working with the material rather than against it. Inside, I moved through the outer districts toward the center, toward the tower. It dominated the interior skyline the way all towers do, by altitude, by statement. Shin had built it tall because tall means visible and visible means present. Power that cannot be seen cannot be feared, and Shin understood, as all effective authoritarians understand, that fear is the cheapest administrative tool available. You don't need a soldier on every corner if everyone on every corner knows the tower is there. I entered through the base. There were guards. There were always guards. I worked through them the same way I had worked through the Crossmen in Paradise Valley, systematically, efficiently, without anger and without hesitation. The anger is a resource you spend. Hesitation is the same. I had a finite supply of both and I needed to conserve. The interior of the tower was different from what I had expected. Shin had a particular aesthetic. It turned out austere in some places, almost severe, and then unexpectedly elaborate in others. The throne room, when I reached it, was both. A large space, high-ceilinged, with the kind of proportions that make a single person standing in it look simultaneously important and small. He had understood the architectural grammar of power. He had furnished the room accordingly. He was waiting for me. Of course he was. Jackal had delivered the message 3 days ago. Shin had known I was coming since then. The encounter at Paradise Valley had been, in retrospect, both a test and an announcement. He had been tracking me. He had wanted to know if I was still capable. He had needed to know what he was facing. He stood at the far end of the room, dressed simply, his posture the same it had always been, that quality of absolute physical confidence, of a body that has been trained past the point where it requires conscious management and simply does what it is designed to do. He looked older than the last time I had seen him. Not worn exactly, but settled. Resolved. "You look worse than I expected," he said. "You look exactly like I expected," I said. He almost smiled. "I had hoped you wouldn't come." "No, you hadn't." He considered this. "No," he agreed, "I hadn't." We stood across from each other in that high-ceilinged room, and I think we were both, in that moment, running through the arithmetic of everything that had led to this, the training we had shared, the school I had lost, the body I had left for dead in a courtyard, the years of walking that I had needed to arrive here. The mathematics of old grief is different from the mathematics of new anger. Old grief is slower and more thorough. It has had time to understand what it's calculating. "Where is Julia?" I said. His expression shifted. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent to it, something he hadn't entirely made peace with. "Safe," he said. "That's not an answer. She is in this building. She is unhurt." "Take me to her." "Fight me first." "Those don't have to be separate events," I said. He came at me then. "I have fought a great many people in my life. I have fought people who were bigger, and people who were faster, and people who had been training for longer. I have fought, in the years since the dojo, men who had developed their own disciplines in the chaos of the wasteland, hybrid forms that combined fragments of real training with improvised adaptations to the specific violences of the post-war world. None of them had been Shin. Shin was the best fighter I had ever encountered, with the single exception of Ryukin, who had existed in a category that I am not certain contained a second member. He knew North Star. He had learned it alongside me from the same master, and he had augmented it with Southern Cross, a style that worked from entirely different principles, that used a warrior's aggression as an instrument rather than a liability. North Star redirects. Southern Cross amplifies. Together, in one body, they created something I had no name for. We fought for a long time. I am going to be honest about what happened. He was winning. Not decisively, not at every moment, but on the whole and in the direction of the engagement, he was winning. He knew my training as well as I did. He had been expecting me to arrive, had been preparing, had been thinking about how this would go while I had been walking through the flatlands thinking about old grief. And he was better than he had been 3 years ago, in the same way that I was better than I had been 3 years ago, but his improvement and mine were not equivalent. He had had 3 years of preparation for a single fight. I had had 3 years of surviving. The difference is real, but it's the kind of difference that doesn't show up until late in a fight, and I needed to survive long enough to reach late. I took serious damage. I want to be clear about this because the story I'm telling you has enough pride in it already without adding false modesty on top. My ribs, the ones Jackal had cracked, which I had not had adequate time to let heal, went from cracked to something more significant somewhere in the middle of the third or fourth sustained exchange. The shoulder that had been struck in Paradise Valley was not responding correctly, which limited the range of strikes I could execute cleanly from that side. There was blood in my mouth from somewhere inside, which I tracked without being able to pinpoint the source. I kept going. Not out of courage, exactly. Courage is a decision you make in advance. What I did was more mechanical than that, the training taking over because I had put enough repetitions into it that it could operate without much input from the parts of me that were failing. Ryukin had talked about this. He had said that the purpose of practice was to build a second body inside your body, one made of motion and judgment rather than flesh, and that when the flesh was compromised, the second body could carry on. I had believed him when he said it. I believed him more in that room, with my ribs moving in ways they weren't designed to move and my shoulder giving me a specific kind of feedback with every third strike. Shin got me on the ground. He was over me, and his face had that settled look again, the look of a decision made. He said something about Julia. I don't remember exactly what he said, only the effect of it. Something about how she had chosen this, chosen him, how what I was fighting for was an idea rather than a reality, how the woman I had loved had made her peace with her situation long ago. It landed. I want to be honest. Grief is not rational in the moment that someone is handing it to you fresh. I had carried 3 years of purpose across the wasteland, and in that moment it felt like it might have been carried in the wrong direction, toward a destination that didn't exist the way I had imagined it. And then I saw the flower. It was small, on a shelf near the window, a plant in a clay pot, and on one of its stems a bud that had opened into a bloom. White petals, unremarkable by any botanical standard. But I recognized the plant. I had given Julia a seed of this variety years ago, before everything, a small stupid gift that I had almost not given because it seemed too sentimental. She had kept it. She had carried it here to this tower, into this situation, and she had kept it alive. In a world where water was the rarest thing and the most valuable, where people died for a canteen, she had kept a plant alive. Not because she had made peace with anything, because she was still the person who cared about small living things. She was still here, the real her, not the story Shin was telling me. I got up. The mechanics of what happened next are not the point. The point is that I was back inside the fight with something different driving it, not grief, not the arithmetic of old wounds, but the specific and steady certainty that came from understanding the room correctly. He had been lying. He had needed me to believe a particular story and had constructed the lie carefully and had nearly succeeded. The fact that it had nearly worked told me something about the degree of threat he still perceived me to represent. If I was truly already dead, as he had said 3 years ago, you don't construct careful lies for the dead. I pressed the advantage. He fought well. I want to give him that. Even in retreat he was controlled, precise, doing real damage with every exchange, costing me things I didn't have to spare. There was a version of that fight where he won it, and it wasn't a remote version. But at some point in every fight, one person stops being the person who is moving toward a conclusion and becomes the person who is moving away from one. Shin crossed that line. I don't know exactly when. I only know that I recognized the moment from the other side of it. When it was over, I stood in that high-ceilinged room above the man who had taken everything I had loved 3 years ago and left me bleeding in a courtyard. I had not gone looking for revenge. I want to say that clearly. Revenge is a destination that looks like it means something but sits on no map. What I had gone looking for was closure, which is different, not the satisfaction of having hurt someone equally but the completion of an interrupted sentence. The night at the dojo had been a sentence without an ending. Now it had one. Shin looked up at me from the floor, and his face had the quality I hadn't seen in it before. A loosening, almost like something that had been held at tension for years was finally released. He didn't ask me to spare him. He didn't negotiate. He just looked at me with those same eyes that had watched Ryukin die, and I understood. In that moment, something I hadn't before, he had been carrying something too. Not guilt exactly, but something. What I did then was what the North Star tradition demands. Not cruelty. Efficiency. The technique that Ryukin had shown me in that interrupted lesson, on a Tuesday, before the sky went orange, applied with the correct 2 fingers at the correct angle. 4 seconds exactly. I counted. I found Julia in the basement, in a room that had clearly been designed as a refuge, comfortable, stocked, furnished as if someone had been trying to make captivity livable. Jackal had been here. He was no longer an operational concern. She looked at me for a long moment without speaking. She looked at my face, at my hands, at the blood on my shirt. Then she looked at the plant she was holding. She had retrieved it from the throne room before coming down here, or perhaps had brought it with her. The white bloom was still open. I kept it, she said. I know, I said, I saw. She didn't ask me what had happened. She already knew, the way people who have been close to violence for a long time know things without being told, not from the details but from the posture, the quality of stillness in someone who has just finished something. We didn't speak much on the way out. There wasn't much to say that the silence wasn't already saying. The Crossmen were still in the city when we emerged from the tower. 30 or 40 of them, organized in the courtyard, having reassembled from wherever the various patrols had been, drawn by the sounds from the tower or by the chain of command that had gone suddenly silent. They were armed and they were watching us. I stood in front of Julia and waited. They looked at each other, they looked at the tower, they looked at me. One by one, beginning with the soldier nearest the center and spreading outward like a thing that moves by contact, they lowered their weapons. Not in defeat exactly, not in the theatrical, formal way of a surrendering army. More like exhaustion, like people who had been organized around a purpose that no longer existed and were feeling the space that left. Several of them knelt. I don't know if they were kneeling to me or kneeling to something else, to the tradition I represented, maybe, or to the idea that there might be something other than what Shin had built. I didn't ask. I let them have whatever it was. I think about Ryukun sometimes, out in the flatlands, when the light is right and the dust is in the air, and everything has that amber bronze quality that makes the world look like it might still become something. I think about the lesson that was interrupted, about the 4 seconds and what a man who understands 4 seconds truly understands about mortality. I think he was telling me something that had nothing to do with pressure points, or rather that had everything to do with them, and also with something beyond them. That the knowledge of how to end things carries inside it necessarily the knowledge of how much it costs to end them. That you cannot hold one without holding both. I think about Bat, carrying his scar somewhere out in the wastelands, probably still organizing, probably still making arguments that nobody has a good counter for. I think about Lynn, who had her eyes back and was learning to use them. I think about a white flower in a clay pot, kept alive in a tower above a dying world, drinking its small share of water every day, waiting. I have the 7 scars still. They ache when the temperature drops, which out here is most of the time. I've stopped noticing the ache separately from everything else. It's just part of the weather now, part of the body's ongoing account of what has happened to it and what it has cost. The world is still broken. The Crossmen still exist in pieces, scattered, leaderless but not gone. The water is still scarce. The deadweed still grows in the cracks of the old highways, and the dust still catches the light at evening and makes everything look slightly unreal. But I'm still here. And I've learned something about that, about still being here when you had every reason not to be, when someone had stood over you and told you that you were already dead and had the skill to make it true. About the specific, quiet, non-negotiable fact of a body that has been trained past the point where it asks permission to continue. You don't win these things. That's not quite the right word for it. You endure them. You carry the cost. You get up when the arithmetic says you shouldn't. And then you put one foot in front of the other in the direction of the thing that matters, across whatever distance it takes, in whatever condition you're in. That's what we do. That's what we've always done. The rest of it, the weapons, the techniques, the pressure points and the 4 seconds and the precise angles of impact, that's just vocabulary. The sentence it's in service of is simpler. It was always simpler. We don't stop. Bat found me 3 weeks after Southern Cross. He had traveled the distance from Paradise Valley on foot, 9 or 10 days with a healing wound in his side. And that tells you more about a person than most of what they'll ever say out loud. He arrived looking gaunt and purposeful and sat down across from me without being invited. The resistance needs organization, he said. You know things the rest of us don't. You could teach. I'm not a teacher, I said. Ryukun was. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back with the same steadiness he had shown at 17, in the dark in Paradise Valley, triangulating Crossmen positions while bleeding. The permanent wariness in his eyes had shifted, not left, but settled into something alongside it. A nascent stillness. The beginning of what watchfulness becomes when it has been tested enough times and survived. What do you want to know? I said. He told me. We talked until the light went and the stars came out, the ones you can see clearly in the flatlands, where generator light doesn't wash them out. A field of them, cold and dense and without opinion, the old constellations still present above a world that had done its best to make them irrelevant. I told him about the pressure points, not as weapons only, as understanding. The body holds a map inside it, drawn over centuries by people who paid close attention to what happened when the body was pushed past its limits, what it reached for, what it abandoned, what it protected at the cost of everything else. Understanding the map does not just tell you how to damage something. It tells you how something is built. And understanding how something is built tells you, if you are paying attention, what it is trying to do. He listened the way careful people listen, storing and cross-referencing. Why does pressing there cause the arm to stop? He asked about one technique I described. There's a nerve relay at that location. When you apply correct pressure, you interrupt the signal. The brain keeps sending. The message doesn't arrive. He was quiet. That's not magic, he said finally. No. Ryukin made it sound like magic. He was a teacher. Sometimes teachers do that. They give something the quality of mystery so students approach it with appropriate seriousness. Did it work on you? I thought about it. For a while, I said, and then I understood enough of the mechanism that the mystery was the mechanism, which is different from the mystery being gone. He nodded slowly, in the way of someone who has just filed something carefully away. Julia sat slightly apart that night, watching the stars. She had said when we left Southern Cross that she intended to return to teaching, not the physical discipline but the philosophy underneath it, the framework for understanding what a life organizes itself around when the organizing structures of civilization have been stripped away, and you are left with raw material and the question of what to make from it. She believed there were people in the wasteland who needed that. I thought she was right. You could do the same, she said to me that night. Not just the fighting, the rest of it. I'm better at the fighting. You're not exclusively that. I didn't answer. I watched the stars instead. She is right about most things I least want to admit. That has been consistent across all the years I have known her, through the dojo years and the years of separation, and whatever these new years are becoming. The ability to see clearly in the directions that matter, even when the person being seen clearly at would prefer some useful opacity. The North Star in Ryukin's teaching is not a destination. It is an orientation point. He was careful about the distinction. A destination is somewhere you arrive and then stop. An orientation point is something you navigate by, fixed, consistent. Visible, that tells you where you are relative to where you want to be and lets you move in any direction from that knowledge. The star itself stays constant. The path you take toward it varies by terrain. I understand it better now than I did at 23. The settlements around Southern Cross have been slowly reorganizing, unevenly, with reversals in the way of everything built from wreckage. The Crossmen who remained, who had knelt in the courtyard as the purpose drained out of them, most of them have found their way into something different, working now under the people they once intimidated, learning what it means to be part of a community rather than an instrument of extraction. Some of them are better at the transition than you would expect. Some are not. The ones who are not are problems that have to be addressed as they come up. That is ongoing. It will always be ongoing. Asher has been building a council structure, fragile, argumentative, necessary, connecting several settlements across the northern flatlands and establishing shared water access that the Crossmen had monopolized for 3 years. It disagrees with itself constantly. It will probably fail in its current configuration and reassemble in a different shape and fail again. That is how these things go. The important thing is that it exists, that it argues, and that the argument is between people with a real stake rather than people performing debate while someone else has already decided. Lynn has been making maps. I did not expect that from her. I expected someone who had endured what she endured, the parents, the lost sight, the time as both orphan and prisoner, to need protection for a long time before extending anything outward. But people have a way of refusing the narrative you have constructed for them. That is one of the more consistently valuable things about people. She walks the wasteland in careful grids, recording water sources and settlement positions and patrol patterns and geographic features, producing on salvaged paper a working map of the world as it currently is. Pre-war maps are useless out here. The cities they show no longer exist in any functional sense. The roads are altered by damage and debris and deliberate rerouting. The water sources indicated have shifted or dried up or been fouled. What Lynn is making is something that did not exist before, an accurate document of the present, not the past. People have already started coming to her for copies of the regional sections. Information about where clean water can be found, how to move safely between settlements, where Crossmen remnants are still active. That information is as valuable as the water itself. I think Ryukin would have appreciated her. He valued precision above most things. Precision is what she has developed. I practice in the mornings. I have done this every day since before the war, since before I had any clear sense of what practice was for beyond the fact that Ryukin required it. I do the forms in the early light, when the air still holds some cold, and the deadweed is as close to quiet as it gets, and I move through each technique as if encountering it for the first time. Not because I have forgotten it. Because the attention you bring to something you believe you already know is different from the attention you bring to something you are approaching fresh, and worse. Ryukin said the greatest enemy of mastery was the feeling of mastery. The moment you believed you were finished learning a thing was the moment you began unlearning it. He was right about that. He was right about most things. The thing I resent most about his death is not having enough years left after it to tell him so. I think about the courtyard most mornings, when my breathing settles and the day ahead becomes real. The stones and the early light through the pine at the north corner, his voice on the 4 seconds, the orange light through the windows, the canvas I wrapped him in because there was nothing else. The grief is different now than it was in the early years. Not smaller exactly, but differently distributed. In those first years it came in concentrated bursts, acute, blinding, triggered by specific things, a particular angle of light, the smell of practice mats, any sound resembling the specific quality of an impact that ends something. Now it is more ambient, more like weather, a condition of the landscape rather than an event within it. I had thought, walking across the wasteland for 3 years, that reaching Southern Cross would change it, that finishing the interrupted sentence would provide some release of pressure. It did not work that way. The grief is still there. What changed is that I know now with certainty that the sentence is not interrupted. It is just longer than I thought. Julia keeps the plant on the windowsill of wherever we are. She has grown good at traveling with it. There is a specific way she wraps the pot to protect it without cutting off light, a technique developed through trial and error, and several near losses that she handled with the calm she applies to most practical problems. The plant is small. Its blooms are white and unremarkable. It requires a precise amount of water she calculates without fail. I asked her once, months after Southern Cross, why that plant? Why that particular seed, out of everything she could have chosen to carry? She thought about it. Because you gave it to me before you knew if I was worth giving things to, she said. You gave it because you wanted to, not because you were certain of anything. I did not know what to say. That matters, she said. That it happened before certainty. Most things happen after certainty is established, which makes them easy. The things that happen before, those are the ones that tell you what someone is made of. I have thought about that conversation a great deal in the time since, about what it means to do something before you are sure of it, about the training that builds the second body inside the body, the one made of motion and judgment rather than flesh, and what it means to build something without knowing if you will ever need it to carry you. You build it anyway. That is the practice. That is what the forms are every morning in the early cold. Construction of a thing you may or may not need, offered to a future you cannot predict in the faith that preparation is never wasted. Ryukin built that in me. It was not wasted. I am trying to build it in whoever will stand still long enough to learn. Lin, in her own way. The former Crossmen who have found their way to something different and want a framework for that difference. The children in the settlements who watch the forms in the morning and want to know what it is. I try to tell them what it is for. The pressure point beneath the left clavicle, struck with the correct 2 fingers at the correct angle. 4 seconds, and then the heart decides what to do next. It still takes 4 seconds. I still count.